The air inside U-5Hertz-21 was a foul cocktail of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and recycled fear. For 3 days, they had been hunted. Above them, on the churning gray surface of the Atlantic, was the British destroyer HMS Hesperus. Below, Captain Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a veteran of 2 years in the Grey Wolf fleet, guided his boat through the crushing dark. His face, illuminated by the dim red light of the control room, was a mask of grim concentration. "Hydrophone, report!" he barked, his voice low but sharp. A young sailor, Hans Vogel, pressed the headphones tighter against his ears, his knuckles white. "Propeller sounds still clear, Herr Kaleon. Closing. He's making his run." The crew braced themselves. This was the devil's dance they knew well. The rhythmic ping, ping, ping of the Allied Aztec sonar would grow louder, more insistent, until the destroyer was directly overhead. Then, a terrifying silence as the sonar beam lost its angle. This was the moment of blindness for the hunters. They were guessing, dropping their depth charges in a preset pattern, hoping for a lucky hit. "Silent running," Richter ordered, though the command was almost unnecessary. Every man held his breath. The only sound was the faint creak of the hull under the immense pressure of the deep. Then came the thunder. The U-boat bucked like a wounded animal. Lights flickered. A cascade of dust and paint flakes rained down, and a lone metal cup clattered to the deck. The explosions were deafening, terrifyingly close, yet they were not direct hits. They were the sound of brute force, not precision. Richter allowed a grim smile. "They're throwing their rubbish bins at us again," he said, loud enough for the crew to hear. A few tense chuckles answered him. They had survived. Again. The British were blind, and as long as they were blind, a skilled commander could slip away. But later, in the privacy of his small cabin, Richter reread the last dispatch from Befehlshaber der U-Boote. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz's reports were becoming increasingly concerned. U-boat losses were climbing at an unsustainable rate. Allied escort groups under the ruthless command of Admiral Sir Max Horton in Liverpool were getting better, more aggressive. The dispatch spoke of new tactics, new radar, and a disturbing rumor from the survivors of a sunken boat. A new weapon. It wasn't about massive explosions. It was something else. Something quiet. They called it Der Eagle, the Hedgehog. From the Journal of Hans Vogel, Radioman 2nd Class, February 17, 1943. "We were depth-charged again. The noise is like God slamming a door. But the Herr Kaleon is a master. He always finds the quiet water. We are safe for now. But the men whisper. They speak of boats that are hit with no warning. No pattern of charges, just a single, sharp crack, and then silence. They say the British now have a weapon that doesn't miss, a claw that reaches forward, not just dropped from behind. I try not to listen. I must focus on the sounds in my headphones, not the ghosts in my head. Aboard HMS Hesperus, the mood was one of cold, professional frustration. Sub-Lieutenant David Evans wiped salt spray from his face, his gloved hands gripping the bridge railing. The convoy, HX-226, was a sprawling, vulnerable beast of merchantmen, and their job was to be the sheepdogs, snapping at the heels of the wolves. The last depth charge run had been a failure, a colossal waste of explosives that had only served to announce their presence and anger the sea. "Lost him again, sir," Evans said to his commanding officer, a taciturn veteran with eyes that had seen too many burning tankers. Commander Furlong grunted, not taking his binoculars from his eyes. "Dropping depth charges is like a blind man throwing rocks at a ghost, Evans. You make a lot of noise, but the ghost is usually long gone." He lowered the binoculars and pointed toward the forecastle, where a strange, multi-spigoted contraption sat under a tarpaulin, pointing skyward like a steel porcupine. "But we have something new." No more blind throws. It was the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar. Unlike depth charges, its 24 small projectiles didn't explode on a timer. They were contact-fused. They only detonated if one of them physically hit the U-boat's hull. If they missed, there was no sound. No reassuring, thunderous explosions to tell the U-boat crew they had survived. Just silence. It was a weapon of surgical precision, a stark contrast to the bludgeon of the depth charge. It was born from the desperate need of men like Admiral Sir Max Horton to turn the tide in the Atlantic. "ASDIC contact, sir." The operator's voice crackled with a new urgency. "Bearing red 15, range 900 yards. He's moving slow. I think it's him." A grim energy jolted the bridge. Furlong was instantly focused. "Right, that's it. Steer to engage. Make ready the Hedgehog. I want no mistakes." Down below, in the metallic confines of U-521, a fragile sense of relief had settled in. The violent bucking had stopped, and the ominous sound of the destroyer's propellers had faded. "He's given up, Herr Kaleun?" Hans Vogel asked, daring to slide one headphone off his ear. Kapitän-Leutnant Richter stood perfectly still, his head tilted. He trusted his instruments, but he trusted his instincts more. Something felt wrong. The hunter had been too close, too persistent to simply give up. "Never assume a Brit has given up, Hans. They are like bulldogs. Keep listening. Report any change." Hans nodded, replacing the headphone. The rhythmic ping, ping, ping of the ASDIC was still there, but it was distant. Yet it wasn't fading anymore. It was steady. Then he noticed something terrifyingly new. The pings were getting closer again, but the high-speed thrash of a destroyer making a depth charge run was absent. The enemy was approaching slowly, deliberately. It wasn't the sound of a blind charge. It was the sound of a stalk. Aboard HMS Hesperus, a cold, disciplined ballet unfolded. Commander Furlong stood with his feet planted wide against the pitch of the deck, his eyes fixed on the ASDIC repeater. The range was closing. 300 yards. 250. "He's holding steady, sir. Doesn't know what we're doing," the sonar operator reported, his voice a tight monotone. "He's expecting the high-speed run. He thinks he has time," Furlong muttered, more to himself than to Sub-Lieutenant Evans. "He's waiting for a thunderclap that will never come." He raised his voice. "Hedgehog team, stand by. On my mark." Evans watched, mesmerized by the terrible new geometry of this hunt. No more guessing. The destroyer's bow was aimed like a rifle. The U-boat was a target pinned by an invisible beam of sound. "Range 200 yards. Firing bearing set," came the call. "Fire," Furlong commanded. There was no mighty roar. Instead, a series of sharp, percussive thumps echoed from the forecastle. One after another, the 24 projectiles of the Hedgehog launched into the gray sky, arcing forward in a perfect, deadly pattern. For a moment, they hung against the clouds like a swarm of dark insects before plunging into the waves ahead of the ship. They entered the water with a series of quiet splashes, barely audible over the ship's engines and the wind. Down in the crushing dark, the crew of U-521 heard it. Hans Vogel ripped his headphones off, his eyes wide with terror. "Herr Kaleun, a new sound. Splashes, all around us, like rain on the surface, but down here." Richter's blood ran cold. The destroyer was still moving slowly, its propellers a steady, menacing hum directly overhead. No depth charge run, no silence of the ASDIC losing contact. Just splashes. The rumors from Donitz's dispatch screamed in his mind. A claw that reaches forward. "Brace for impact," he roared, but his voice was drowned out by the crew's panicked shouts. They were braced for the familiar, earth-shaking whoom of a distant charge. They were not prepared for what came next. On the bridge of the Hesperus, every man held his breath. Furlong stared at the stopwatch in his hand. The projectiles were sinking. 10 seconds. 15. "Now we wait, Evans," he said, his voice a low whisper. "If we hear nothing, we fire again. If we hear even one small bang." 20 seconds. The silence from below was absolute. In the control room of U-591, the seconds stretched into an eternity of terror. The crew looked at each other, their faces pale in the red gloom. Where were the explosions? Was it a dud run? Had they been spared? Richter knew better. This wasn't a reprieve. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The rumors were true. This was Der Eigel. And then it happened. It wasn't a deep, rumbling explosion that shook the entire boat. It was a single, shockingly intimate crack. Sharp, localized, and brutally final. It came from just aft of the control room. The sound was immediately followed by the high-pitched shriek of steel tearing apart and the violent, unstoppable roar of the Atlantic Ocean bursting into the aft torpedo room. The lights went out. The deck tilted violently backwards as the stern filled with water. Men screamed as they were thrown against bulkheads. The air filled with the smell of ozone from short-circuiting electronics and the icy, salty spray of the sea. U-521 was mortally wounded, its back broken not by a blind giant, but by the precise sting of a single, silent hornet. Chaos was a physical force. Inside U-521, the world had turned into a violent, screaming nightmare of darkness and freezing water. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a hellish red glow on a scene of utter pandemonium. The boat was angled steeply, stern down, and the roar of the sea was no longer outside the hull. It was inside, a hungry beast devouring them from within. "Damage report," Richter yelled, clinging to a valve wheel to keep his footing on the sharply tilted deck. The chief engineer, his face bleeding from a gash on his forehead, scrambled up from the engine room hatch. "Aft torpedo room is gone, Herr Kaleon. The bulkhead won't hold. We're going down by the stern." "Blow all tanks. Emergency surface," Richter commanded, his voice a raw command over the din. The sickening hiss of compressed air filled the boat, a desperate last breath. But the deck angle only steepened. The weight of the flooded compartments was too much. The boat was a stone, and the air was just bubbles rushing past a sinking coffin. Richter watched the depth gauge needle spinning relentlessly clockwise. 150 meters. 170. 200. Crush depth was approaching. "It's no good," the engineer shouted, his voice cracking with despair. The hull began to speak. It started with groans, long, tortured moans of stressed metal. Then came the sharp pops and cracks, like pistol shots in the confined space, as rivets gave way and pipes burst. For Hans Vogel, thrown against the radio equipment, the symphony of destruction was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of his world being unmade. Richter knew it was over. He looked at the terrified young faces around him, boys who had trusted him. "Abandon ship," he ordered, his voice hollow. "To the tower. May God be with you." It was a futile command. A scramble began in the slanted, water-slicked corridor towards the conning tower hatch, but it was a clumsy, panicked ballet of death. The boat gave a final violent lurch. A cascade of water burst through a ruptured forward bulkhead, sweeping men off their feet. The last thing Hans Vogel saw in the dying red light was Kapitänleutnant Richter, standing firm in the control room, a captain choosing to go down with his vessel as the lights finally extinguished for good, plunging them into absolute blackness. Aboard HMS Hesperus, the sonar operator pulled off his headphones, his face pale. "Sir, I heard it. A single crack. And now, oh God." He listened again. "The hull, it's breaking up. I can hear it groaning, popping, screaming, sir." Commander Furlong stood motionless on the bridge, listening not with his ears, but with his soul, to the death of the machine and the men deep below. There was no triumph, only a profound, chilling finality. He had not heard 100 thunderous explosions, but the single, precise report of an execution. He looked at Evans, whose youthful face was a mask of awe and horror. "That," Furlong said quietly, "is the sound of victory in this war, Mr. Evans. Remember it." He turned away, looking out at the cold, indifferent waves. "God have mercy on their souls." Excerpt from the personal log of Sub-Lieutenant David Evans, HMS Hesperus, February 18, 1943. "We sank a U-boat today. My first confirmed kill. We used the Hedgehog. There was no great battle. We fired, and a few seconds later the sonar man heard a single, sharp bang. Then, nothing but the sound of a metal hull tearing itself to pieces under the pressure. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The men cheered, but the commander was silent. I don't feel like celebrating. We never saw them. They never had a chance to fight back. It felt less like a battle and more like an extermination. Is this what it takes to win?" On the surface, the sea offered up its dead. A spreading stain of diesel fuel shimmered on the gray waves, followed by a few pathetic pieces of debris, a splintered crate, a sailor's cap, and a single empty life jacket. The crew of HMS Hesperus, who had cheered at the sonar operator's report, fell silent as they watched the ghostly evidence rise from the depths. This was not the triumphant aftermath of a naval battle. It was the quiet tidying up after an execution. Sub-Lieutenant Evans stood beside Commander Furlong on the bridge wing, the cold wind whipping at his face. "So that's it then," Evans said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's it," Furlong confirmed, his gaze fixed on the oil slick. "No grand chase, no dramatic escape. We pointed, we fired, they died." He turned to face the younger man, his expression devoid of any joy. "The old hunt was a contest of nerves and skill, Evans. Richter, or whoever was down there, was a professional. He knew the dance. He expected us to be blind when we were on top of him. He was waiting for the thunder." Furlong gestured towards the now covered Hedgehog launcher. "We just changed the rules. We took away his chance to be lucky. We took away the thunder and replaced it with a whisper. That is a terrible thing to do to a sailor, even an enemy one." Weeks later, the event registered as 2 very different entries in the ledgers of war. In Liverpool, at the headquarters of the Western Approaches Command, Admiral Sir Max Horton reviewed the after-action report from HMS Hesperus. The data was clean, efficient, and beautiful in its brutal logic. 1 U-boat confirmed sunk. Ordnance expended, 24 Hedgehog projectiles. 1 confirmed hit. It was proof. The tide was turning not with grand fleets, but with physics and innovation. The Hedgehog was no longer an experiment. It was the new grammar of anti-submarine warfare. Thousands of kilometers away, in a concrete bunker in Lorient, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz looked at a different list. A longer list. Against the entry for U-521, a clerk had made a simple notation. "Überfällig, als vermisst anzusehen." Overdue, presumed lost. There had been no final radio message, no distress call reported by other boats in the Wolf Pack. One moment, Kapitän Leutnant Richter was a hunter. The next, he and his 48-man crew had simply vanished from the map. They were erased. The silence from the Atlantic was more terrifying than any battle report. For Dönitz, the growing number of these silent losses confirmed a horrifying new reality. The hunters had become the hunted. Aboard the Hesperus, as it plowed through the endless gray expanse, Evans often found himself staring at the sea. He still heard the sonar pings in his sleep. But it was the silence that truly haunted him now. The old fear was the fear of the known, the roar of depth charges, the shaking hull, the fight for survival. The new fear, the fear of the hedgehog, was the fear of the unknown. It was the dread of a quiet rain you couldn't see, the terror of a single precise tap on the shoulder from God in the crushing dark, followed by nothing. It was the fear of being erased, leaving behind nothing but a slick of oil and an echo of silence on a cold, indifferent sea.